And our last panelists are Professor Sreedhar and Ms. Delmas, so they're going to split the time. So, go ahead.
So actually, we are going to split the time in the following way. So these comments are a product of a cooperative endeavor, but since we are not supposed to speak for more than 10 minutes and the hour is late, I'm going to read them and then she will field questions. We're going to focus our comments on the final pages of Part 4, which is on morality. And in these pages, Dworkin explicitly discusses the problem of political obligation. And it's interesting and significant that political obligation is located in his discussion of morality, where he goes over trolley problems and duty to rescue and obligation to others, and not in the next section, which is on politics. So life in political societies appears to pose an irredeemable threat to the two faces of human dignity. The requirement that I take responsibility for my own life seems threatened by the government's claim to authority over me. My ethical independence, to use Dworkin's term, is undermined by my subordination to higher powers. As he notes, everyone who is not a dictator faces this challenge. Moreover, the demand that I recognize the objective importance of other people's lives appears flouted when I join in the exercise of collective power in order to force others to do as the majority wishes. Dworkin's project in the final part of Part 4 is to dispel this worry by showing that under certain conditions, submission to political authority is not only compatible with, but morally required by, the principles of dignity. We want to suggest that a different conclusion might be drawn from his account. So his key claim is that government doesn't violate dignity if it treats all those it governs with equal concern. The political procedures and general structure of law must be understood as expressing full and equal respect for all. For Dworkin, the conditions under which coercive collective power does not threaten dignity spell out the conditions of political legitimacy. The state is legitimate if, and only if, 1, it acknowledges the right of each citizen to take responsibility for her life, and 2, it judges the fates of all citizens as equally important. Dworkin further considers that a community that protects the two requirements of dignity in this way has the moral power to create and enforce obligations on its members. Political legitimacy thus entails the moral right to demand compliance by and exercise coercion on the governed. So crucially, Dworkin wants to argue that submission to legitimate political authority is not only compatible with, but required by the principles of dignity. Albeit conceptually distinct, state legitimacy and political obligation correlate and are mutually coextensive. Citizens are morally bound to obey the laws of their community when and to the extent that these emanate from a legitimate government. The principles of dignity provide the bridge in Dworkin's argument from the state's right to coerce to the citizen's duty to comply. Indeed, state legitimacy entails political obligation insofar as members of the political community can treat collective decisions, even those they disapprove, as issuing from a process in which each has an equal voice. The idea is that someone who properly values dignity in herself and others must do her part in securing a government that protects each citizen's dignity. So note that, interestingly, Dworkin insistently denies that political obligation only holds in democracies, even though he considers tempting the claim that a state cannot treat all those it governs with equal concern unless it gives each of them an equal voice in the political process. Indeed, he balks at this conclusion because it would entail the notion, too counterintuitive to be defensible, in his opinion, that, quote, most of the subjects of most of the political communities over history had no moral duty to obey the laws of their community. So he says it's too counterintuitive to accept the conclusion that most people in most societies over time had no obligation to obey the laws of their community as such. So that means he has the intuition that most people in most societies did have political obligation. Eager to resonate with common intuitions about political obligation, Dworkin suggests that both state legitimacy and political obligation come in degrees and depend on, quote, the character and spirit of working political practices, end quote, rather than on the form of government. This way, according to Dworkin, although democracies are the true models of legitimate governments, reasonably just monarchies, decent hierarchical societies, and indeed most, or at least many, of the political communities that have existed historically and at present can be regarded as satisfying the conditions of legitimacy. Political obligation, even if it's only a matter of degree, is thus not the exception, rather it is the norm. Indeed, Dworkin's examples of states that fail to generate political obligation are quite extreme and may plausibly be regarded as tragic episodes that fall outside the ordinary course of history. As he says, quote, political obligation wholly fails for any group that is systematically denigrated in second-class citizenship, or none at all, as the antebellum South, Nazi Germany, apartheid South Africa, the genocidal nations of Africa, and Soviet tyranny, end quote. Political obligation thus normally prevails, while its failure seems to be relatively exceptional. This seems to suggest Dworkin's favorable judgment regarding the legitimacy of contemporary Western states, as well as the political obligation of their citizens. According to Dworkin, in the quote that I just read, it seems like he's saying that only the group that is being excluded from the collective enterprise of governance is exempt from political obligation. So he says, political obligation wholly fails for any group that is systematically denigrated in second-class citizenship. He doesn't say political obligation wholly fails when any group is systematically denigrated in second-class citizenship, or none at all. It fails for that group. But we suspect that instead, Dworkin's own principles of dignity would call, in those conditions, for a generalized failure of political obligation, right, in these cases of systematic discrimination against a group within the community. So note that the failure of political obligation doesn't necessarily entail a license to disobey the law. Compliance with the law may be justified by appeal to other moral and non-moral principles. However, it seems to us a citizen cannot be morally bound to abide by the rules that systematically discriminate against a group of fellow citizens while benefiting her. If she did so, she would fail to recognize the objective importance of other people's lives as his principles of dignity demand. So if this is right, if it's right that in cases like apartheid South Africa, it's not just that political obligation wholly failed for blacks. Indeed, it seems like it would have failed for the white members of society also, even that were benefiting from the system, because they would be participating in a system that used coercive control over others. And according to Dworkin's account, as I understand it, that's forbidden. That would be not respecting the objective importance of other people's lives. So if that's right, then having one's dignity recognized and respected by one's community is not sufficient to incur an obligation to obey its law. So the demands of dignity cannot be fulfilled for anyone unless the community actually treats everyone with equal concern and respect. As we see it, that follows logically from Dworkin's own account. If it doesn't, we would love to hear why. Furthermore, we suspect that Dworkin assesses the legitimacy of actual states with a bit of excessive optimism. He holds that the conditions of governmental legitimacy obtain enough of the time and to a sufficient extent that political obligation is prevalent in our states. So remember, he says that he finds it too counterintuitive to say that most people in most states didn't have an obligation to obey the law. But he later explains legitimacy concretely requires political equality. Quote, everyone must be permitted to participate in the right way in the collective decisions that make up his governance, end quote. A community that generates political obligation is one that's governed by the people as a whole, acting as partners in the joint enterprise of self-governance. So, based Dworkin's own intent, the principles of dignity and the collective enterprise of self-governance that alone truly meets them provide the basis for perhaps a radical critique of existing political communities, the majority of which would fall far off the mark of legitimacy. As Dworkin himself remarks, universal suffrage does not guarantee that all citizens have an equal say in the political process. He optimistically conceives of systematic discrimination such as Jim Crow laws as belonging to the early history of American democracy, while he laments the Supreme Court's recent decision to uphold the constitutionality of state rules requiring registered voters to produce a driver's license or other picture ID to access the ballots, and thereby effectively disenfranchising the poor. It seems reasonable to doubt that everyone is granted equal political standing in most of our mature democracies, or even our most mature democracies. If we are right about the implications of Dworkin's theory, then localized but serious violations of political equality entail a generalized failure of political obligation. Of course, to be fair, Dworkin conceives of political obligation as a matter of degree, not an all or nothing thing. So we can put the point in a slightly weaker but more precise way, as follows. So to the extent that a state fails to treat some of its citizens with equal concern, the political obligation of those citizens, and more importantly, the political obligation of the privileged citizens, is lessened or diminished. This claim is much stronger, though, when we consider history. Most states have disenfranchised, oppressed, or persecuted at least some of their members. It seems to us, then, that it follows that against Dworkin's intuition to the contrary, most people in most states over history haven't had much genuine political obligation. So we find attractive, very attractive, the idea that my relationship to the state is affected by how the state treats you. But we see this idea as having radical potential that Dworkin seems to overlook. In particular, it provides resources not only for a critique of past and present societies, but it seems to serve as a basis for a pretty forceful demand that's imposed on members of privileged groups as such. Thank you.